All right, so this morning we have a really exciting group of panelists, I think. It's a very comprehensive and interesting grouping of papers. We're covering a variety of topics on women in governance. We're going to start with Walid. I'll introduce everyone a little bit more specifically in a second, but we'll start with Walid's paper, which is going to give us kind of a broad overview of some of the social and political obstacles facing Afghan women and girls today. And then we're going to have three papers that are much more specific and cover different sectors and topics. Right? So Freshta will be speaking about management and HR. Hogai will be talking about indigenous methodologies and research. Okay? And then, of course, Dr. Saleh Noorani will be speaking about diabetes, okay? So health concerns. Right? So we're going to begin with Walid, okay, and this is Walid Halimi. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at the University of Westminster. Okay. So Walid, if you'd like to begin. Walid,
I'll just move out because I'll never be able to sit here and present the presentation.
Okay. And just a reminder, so when you guys have 2 minutes left, I will pass you this little slide.
I should be a magician to talk about Afghan women's obstacles or enduring barriers in 7 minutes. It's extremely difficult. Let's say good luck.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Another mistake that I have made, my wife is here, and since I got married, I've lost my courage, my talents, and all that. So another mistake, she shouldn't have been here. Oh, thanks for coming. I'm joking. Afghan women's enduring barriers. I would like to give you a kind of general picture of the attempts that we try to change Afghan women's status in the society, and then I'll be more specific about religious and cultural misconceptions, because I personally believe, and the research that I did perform indicates that our main problem is harmful traditional practices. Unless we kind of make a dialogue and cure that part of the society, we will not be able to make progress. We spend a lot of money, we did a lot of infrastructure work, but we have not changed people's mentality, and I think we have to start from there. So let's go to the first, next slide. Like as I said, the Afghan humans, we're all living together. When we say woman, we shouldn't think just woman, because a family is like women, men, and children, and everyone. So it is so interwoven. The issues related to women's status is very interwoven. You cannot separate it from other social factors. That's why I want to start with cultural and religious misconceptions when I'm talking about the barriers in Afghanistan on the way to developments. And then we'll come back to the slide later on. If you can do the next slide, please. I think you have not opened the presentation, so quickly. Let's see if you can help with this. Yes, it's copied. It's in one of your files. The modernization period in Afghanistan started with King Amanullah Khan's attempts to change the society, and he really took some fundamental steps to free Afghan women from the prison and gave them their basic rights to education, rights to marriage, and many other fundamental rights. But it is very difficult to conclude on his achievements because there was a revolution, a religious revolt against his achievement, and that's why he was toppled from the power. And the scholar says that his approach to society was very hectic. He visited Europe several times, and then he wanted to change the society very quickly, make Afghanistan and the Paris of Europe at the time. So that's why the religious segments of society revolt against him. But from a social movement theory, it's very difficult to accept that somebody in the East with the North communicated and made a revolution against King Amanullah Khan. So it could have some other external factors at the time, because he was the one who retained the Afghan independence from the British colony. So it's possible that the British colony have played a bigger role, but it's not proven. It is a very hot discussion. King Zahir Shah continued his policies, and during King Zahir Shah, the Afghan women could go to Kansas, they could go to schools, and they had all those basic rights. Up until Dr. Najibullah's governments, the women had all those blessings left from King Amanullah Khan's reforms. But Mujahideen, the day they started their struggle to fight against the Russians in the context of the Cold War, the Mujahideen targeted women. It was all about women, what they wear, how they walk, and all that. So Taliban kind of put a full stop or denial. Like Mujahideen started and Taliban finished that. And now we are in post-2001, a moderate approach. And I believe we are doing well so far in terms of our approach to this Afghan society. We are trying to be very considerate. This picture, I have chosen these three pictures, and I would like you, I'm glad that we have Afghans and non-Afghans in this forum. So if I asked you to just think for a minute what this picture presents and then what this presents, if you were an Afghan, what type of a if we can vote on these in terms, because Afghan, when I said Afghan women's appearance, status determined every political transformation in Afghanistan. That's why it's very important what Afghan woman is wearing, how she appears in society, because we are dealing with an extremely traditional society, an extremely fundamentalist religious society. I'm proud to be a Muslim, but unfortunately some people, they're so much fundamentalist that they cannot show the beauty of Islam to the other to non-Muslims. So just anyone can say which one will you vote for Afghanistan if you were an Afghan or a social scientist? Yes, ma'am.
I will vote for all three of them. As an Afghan woman, I should be allowed to wear a burqa if I want to. And if I want to vote or join a contest, I would like to have that right.
That's a very holistic approach. Excellent. Anyone want to comment on the pictures? I know it's very sensitive, yes?
My first instinct was the middle one, because that for me is the embodiment of making your voice known. The left for me is, I don't even need to explain why, it's a no. And the right for me is, there's an argument for me in the back of my mind that says that adopting Western ideals isn't the definition of progress, and there's a risk of falling into that category if I say the right one. So I'm going to go possibly for the safe option and say the middle one.
Thank you.
I would just make one comment. I mean, it's easy to fall, but it's so difficult to get back. So you have to take steps by steps.
Thank you very much. That can kind of, this could be during or after Amanullah Khan, King Amanullah Khan, and it was criticized to a big extent. Next slide, please. And go ahead, please, yes. The Prophet Muhammad started a revolution, and the women were able to. The right of women starts with having. If I was a young woman, I must be able to choose whom I'm marrying. If I don't have that right, then I have no rights. So Prophet Muhammad gave that right in a dark age to the Muslim woman in the society at the time. So why not now? And that was a revolutionary. And I was reading this is research by Banu Rugzai. She has done research for Commonwealth Studies, and she says it was a revolution, but then it it is intermingled or mixed with traditional values. That's why there's a big misconception among non-Muslims that this is Islam. That it doesn't allow women to work in the society. It doesn't allow women to get married to whom to their preferred partner. So this is the bigger misconception. And gender inequality in education is huge in Afghanistan. It's extremely huge. There are 90% literate women compared to 49% men. So you can see that the gap or the inequality is there. I keep hearing from my family members, from our fellow Afghans, that this condition is not suitable for women. So Taliban were reasoning this, that I don't know, we are living only like, if you're very lucky nowadays, you live 78 years of your life. So I don't know when this condition will be suitable for the women to, if it is suitable for men, it's definitely suitable for women. So it's just a reason. And religious conceptions that I was researching, I found that seek knowledge, even if seeking knowledge is the duty of every Muslim. I had read this part, but I don't know why that bit doesn't appear. It says every Muslim. It doesn't say only men should seek knowledge. So these are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Seek knowledge even from the cradle to the grave. Like it doesn't has a limit time. Seek knowledge even if it's in China. So these are very persuasive sayings from religion, which is unfortunately a stable source of terrorism and all blah blah. Anyways, let's go ahead, please. Harmful practices, two practices that I really want to focus now, and the whole presentation is about, is bad and badal. The bad is when a male criminal person does something in a society, a huge crime or kill somebody, then the families, because to settle that, they give a woman, they even don't ask that woman, that girl, that whether or you agree or not, to just settle that criminal matter, they give this woman to the victim to just settle that situation. Badal is like when you're marrying a woman, you want to marry, you like a woman in your family for cousins or someone, then their family says, if you give your woman to my son, then you'll make a badal, it's called an exchange. And this woman who becomes a victim, she will suffer all his life because of this family traditional harmful practice. And it is totally against Islam according to many. There's a very nice research on that, UNIMA and OCR, they have done a research. The research is very beautiful. They have explained the human rights of Afghan women from an Islamic perspective and also from the human rights perspective. It's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, so the latest reports says that 57% of Afghan marriages are child marriages, which is another disaster in Afghanistan. That's why in recommendations or the way forward I will propose a solution for that. And progress and development, we do have progress since 2001. Afghanistan has changed a lot. The Asia Foundation report shows that the badal and the bad trend is downward. People are not accepting that. People find that harmful, so the people are ready to change. And you will see the graph. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, the graph is downward, which is less people are ready to do better than bad in Afghanistan, which is a very good sign. And next one, please. I'll take one more or 2 minutes. Just 1 minute for ladies and 1 minute for me.
Maybe 1 minute, just to make sure that everybody gets this, the
Okay.
panel is equal in terms of time.
Thank you very much. 3 million registered voters. We had women. Yeah. We had 400 female candidates and 68 allocated seats in Afghanistan Parliament. It's always there for women. Over 9 million children are enrolled in school. 3.5 million are girls, which is a very good sign. Public and private universities have enrolled 300,000, including 100,000 women, which is a great achievement. Next slide, please. The way forward, I will just, because we are running out of time, the rights of women or women's rights should be included in a high school curriculum, because a woman who is 18 or 16 years old, she should be able to know what are her basic rights. And the government should interfere. We are not using media. We see so many Afghan nice channels that can kind of compete with BBC in terms of quality. But have you ever seen any dialogue discussing women's rights? You don't usually see those dialogues, and people are not ready to come on, especially the religious scholars are not ready to come and sit on the table and define what's women. We had a woman's elimination of violence against women, and that's now passed, but it's not implemented. And implementation is another problem in Afghanistan. Can you go back to the model, please? Yeah, that woman is Afghan woman's Minister of Women Affairs, and she has a message to participate in election. No other minister has done that. That's why I copied and pasted her. Just go to the slide number 4, please, and I'll stop it there. Back to number 4, please. No, one more, please. Yes. Yeah, this one. So in institutionalization, in order to make an Afghan woman self-sufficient, you need to institutionalize all that. Public awareness, access to education, equal opportunities. If we have 500 scholars graduated from universities and we don't provide them jobs opportunities, then it will be useless. Thanks for listening. I hope you have understood. I'm usually talking very fast. My wife was there, I was under pressure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that really interesting presentation, Walid. And hopefully, when we have, at the end of all the presentations, we'll have questions and answers, so we can go back to some of the issues that were raised or ask for clarification. Okay. Great. So next we have Hogai Yorabi, and she's also a PhD candidate in the Department of Peace Education at Cambridge. Okay, she's going to speak for, I'll give you guys 7 minutes, so everything's equal. On the topic of using indigenous methodologies in studies conducted or connected to Afghanistan. Conducted. In Afghanistan.
Hello everyone, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've done this presentation 6 times before. I've always had 55 minutes, but I'll do it in 7 minutes. I'll run through it. So when the PowerPoint comes up,
Would you like to sit here?
doesn't matter, it's fine. Should I stand?
I think it's easy. Why don't we switch?
Okay. I can stand. Okay. So the reason why I named it Reflecting Back and Thinking Forward, Indigenous Methodology, is because we have to reflect back on what research used to be like. There's a groundbreaking study called Anthropology and Colonialism, and it showed how research used to be people taking people's skulls and measuring it by putting rice in it and pebbles and saying, look, people in foreign settings are not as intelligent. And so these methods were really unorthodox, they're very unethical. And so the very first quote will sort of show what I mean. We have a history of people putting Maori under a microscope in the same way a scientist looks at an insect. The ones doing the looking are giving themselves the power to define. So when we use research methods from the West and we just put them in foreign settings, such as in Afghanistan, we can reproduce some of the colonial and neo-colonial ways that we have reproduced knowledge. So Smith states that in post-colonial discourses has been defined in ways which we can still leave out indigenous peoples, our ways of knowing and our current concerns. So we think that these ways and these practices are no longer used, but some of the research that has come out in the last decade was an anthropologist who was in Afghanistan, and she looked at a family and she published a lot of the research from the family in unethical ways in which the family was then known in Kabul, and there was a lot of reprimands coming in from the community, and there was a lot of backlash, and it was giving away their identities. So, I'm sorry, I'm like rushing through it, and therefore I'm like leaving out some things. But so some of the myths in education is that more education leads to more peace, but actually we need to look at the sort of education that we implement in these areas. And we can see from the Taliban era times, they used education as a form of violence, and they instilled hate. And not just the Taliban, in the Soviet era, the communists did this as well. And in the present era, we can leave out indigenous ways, right? We can leave out women from the textbooks. We sometimes don't list all of the ethnic identities, and history can be very biased. We can leave out people's history, and in this way reproduce some of the violence. But we can look at Syria as an example. One of the most educated populations in the Middle East went into a big war, into a civil war, Afghanistan. We can look at how that education has just caused more violence. And so what we advocate for, what indigenous methodology advocates for, is to do bottom-up approaches that are sustainable and that are culturally relevant and community-based, that respond to the local needs and wants of the communities. And this practice of picking up a best practice in, let's say, in the US, some of the practices that are really good, and just dropping them in Afghanistan don't always work. And so we have to look at what is relevant in the ground and then work with the community to co-design, co-undertake, co-produce, and co-own the work. And this goes for research as well. So a lot of the time we go into Afghanistan. So even when I was doing my PhD, I created the design of it in England, right? And then I went to Afghanistan and then I undertook it, and I realized right away how unethical that was. What I should have done was go to Afghanistan and co-create the research with the women on the ground and say, look, what is important to you and what can we do to address that, right? And they should have worked with me on the research But instead, I produced it in Cambridge. I went over with this thinking of what I thought would be important, and then I undertook it there. So I had to take a step back and redo the whole process. And so I went to Afghanistan and I talked to the women on the ground and I said, what do you want to talk about? What is important to you? And what I thought was important to them wasn't. And so we co-created the research design and then we implemented it together, right? So it wasn't me doing all of the research design and then just doing the data gathering in the foreign setting. It was me going over there and both of us collecting the data together and then giving them the reciprocity and like respectful collaboration and ownership of the research results. So a lot of the research that right now that we undertake in Afghanistan is normally, well, the first author on an article is normally the primary author and owns a lot of the, gets the credit for the research. So just saying that when you go over there, there should be mutual ownership of those research articles. And research needs to not be done on indigenous people or to indigenous people. And when I say indigenous, I mean all Afghans. It doesn't mean historically linked. So indigenous in indigenous methodology means compared to a settler population. So Aboriginals, Native Americans in the US, and in Afghanistan it would include all Afghans because there wasn't a settler population. So if I went to Afghanistan, I would be somewhat of an outsider. I was born in Kabul, but I was 2 weeks old when I left. So if I go there and I just do this research onto people, it would be unethical, right? What I should go is do the research with and for the indigenous populations. So I would go in, co-design it, co-undertake it, co-produce it, and co-own it. And some of the methods that we use in this methodology, and methodology is different from methods, right? Method is a form of research that you do, but a methodology is an approach that you take. So there's various methods you can use, and you don't need to be indigenous to the population, but using these methods will make it more ethical. So you can do things like storytelling, right? This is something done widely in Afghanistan. So translating the articles into the language that you're in, so if it's translated into Dari, Pashto, and whatever other languages, would make it more ethical, right? Because just going in and then taking people's knowledge and putting your name on it, and then you gaining a position out of it and gaining money and research articles is not fair to the people. There's a famous saying that came out of the Native American group in the US, and they said, we've been researched to death, right? You come in, you research us, you research us, you research us, and we've gained nothing of it. So what is a reciprocity in it? And if you're gonna come in, what are we actually gaining out of it? And if you're coming in and you're collecting all of these stories from these Afghan women, what are they gaining out of it? Are you just collecting their stories and putting your name on it? Or are you going in and saying, look, we will reimburse you, we will, there's another saying that came out of the Native American groups, and he said, look, research is one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous dictionary because it's historically been you coming in, taking our ways of knowledge and our ways of knowing, completely undermining us, and then you gaining all these benefits, and we have gained nothing out of it. But so this is saying when you come in, we want reciprocity and we want something in return, right? So this group, indigenous group in North America was like, okay, are we getting air conditioners out of it? What are we getting out of it? You're just coming in and you're taking things and you're not giving us anything in return. So just keeping that in mind when we do research in Afghanistan, we don't know better. As a diaspora, it is our responsibility to go there and learn from the people on the ground because they do know their situation better than we do. We don't know what they need. They know what they need. So this goes down to charity as well, right? If we say, look, we're gonna fund this and this and this, that's not right because they know what they need. And so we should be going there and saying, okay, what do you need? Where do you need the funding to go? And all of these charities, Farkhanda Trust does a good job because they go over there and they ask what they need on the ground. But some of these charities, right, they have their own agendas. The World Bank has their own agenda. They want development, so they push development. But what this does is just, in this neoliberal world, it doesn't actually increase like Afghanistan's development. It just, in the last 10 years, when we've pushed this development agenda, it's just created more social inequalities, and more education doesn't always translate into more development. It's the type of education you put in, and if it's not sustainable and ground up that meets the local needs and wants of the community, then what we're doing is perpetuating this cycle of like creating this sweatshop nation, like many of the countries in the Middle East that just go into this global capitalist world where I'm sorry, am I going over?
No, finish your sentence. I
Okay.
think.
So it's just going into this world of like, this global capitalist world where countries are getting poorer, social inequality is getting worse, and we're not really benefiting anyone when we're saying, okay, just copy everything from the West. We cannot reproduce the West in a country. We need to look at what they want on the ground, and if the education is meant to be culturally relevant, you can't just make it secular. You need to integrate religion. I'm just gonna stop because I know you're gonna have questions and I can address your questions rather than going on and on.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to stop on.
Yeah, okay, sorry for going over and being sporadic, but I was trying to do 55 minutes in 7 minutes.
That's fine.
Sorry.
That's fine, Joe. I think you kind of ended where you started, so that was a good, came full circle. All right, so next we have Freshta Omar, and Freshta is an HR Director in Diversity and Inclusion at the Ministry of Justice in the UK. And she's going to speak to us, deliver a presentation on the topic of human resources management, a comparative analysis of recruitment processes in the UK and Afghanistan.
Thank you. No, I'm fine. Is the presentation up? Fantastic. So good morning to everyone and a warm welcome. I can see the cameras going up already. I'm honoured to be given this platform among these esteemed individuals sat next to me. As mentioned, I'm going to speak to you about HR management systems and specifically the recruitment system and the comparisons between the UK and Afghanistan. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So Human Resources is a department which formally deals with employees and their issues within the workforce. This includes management, compensation, benefits, training, onboarding, and organizational development, but it's not limited to this. Human resources specialists work collaboratively with the business and partner with other functions within an organization to ensure that there is effective management of the employee lifecycle. The human resources function plays a critical role in developing and making an organization a success by supporting employees through their careers and ensuring that employees have the opportunity to bring their best selves to work. Given the political climate of our country, and by this I mean Afghanistan, in the last 4 decades of war, attention has been drawn to security, health, and welfare, rather than putting in place in framework to establish HR management in the sense that it functions within the UK. Nevertheless, there has been some attention through some administrative processes, and this is by the Independent of the Administrative Reform and Civil Services Commission. Within the UK, policies include relating to all aspects of human life cycle, and the employee life cycle sits within the human resources function and is aligned to the labour laws of the country which we live in. Employees in the UK are obligated to protect their staff, and in some organisations, trade unions work independently to ensure that the rights of the employees are protected. However, trade unions which were established in Afghanistan, this is pre-war, and supported the workforce are no longer systematically connected to the human resources function. As you will be aware, the employee life cycle begins with the individual being recruited into an organisation. This is the process at inception, which then sets the path for success for the individual. Within the UK, the recruitment and HR specialists work together with the business to ensure that demand for staff is met. With the department's recruitment strategy in mind, campaigns are started to attract potential employees to job adverts. As you all know, and that we're familiar with, upon application, candidates are often requested to submit a CV, so a curriculum vitae. Successful applicants have then shortlisted with their CV screening, and the second part of this recruitment process is whereby individuals are invited to partake in interviews. Individuals are also invited to partake in a number of tests. This could be psychometric tests, verbal reasoning tests, or numerical tests, but it's not limited to this. Those successful at this stage are then offered a role within the organisation that they are working for. Now, it's important to highlight that by By utilizing recruitment policies, the end-to-end recruitment process can be made transparent and consistent to ensure that a fair process is practiced. For Afghanistan, it's imperative that a sound situational analysis is carried out to identify the contextual variables that influence human resources, and there seems to be a lack of this. Where possible, recruitment data should be captured. For example, the length of a time a successful recruitment campaign takes, the number of applicants during that process, dropout rates at each stage, and finally, one that's close to my heart, diverse data for both applicants and those appointed to role. Subsequently, these insights can provide valuable analytics for the organization to analyze their recruitment process as well as those appointed to role. Now, the growth of analytics and data is a recent phenomenon that's been used in the UK, and this real-time analysis can be hugely beneficial for a country like Afghanistan. The lessons learned through implementation of HR policies can be shared with Afghanistan to ensure that there is sharing of knowledge and best practices between the UK and Afghanistan. Best practices are used within these frameworks can be designed and implemented. This will ensure that common pitfalls are avoided, and there is, again, transparency, equality, inclusivity, and diversity at every step of the HR process. Even though relevant policies are in place within human resource and recruitment in Afghanistan, there seems to be gaps, challenges, and obstacles with the implementation of these HR policies. Therefore, closer interaction and also an increased share of knowledge between the UK and the Afghanistan reform system is urgently needed. How much time? Perfect. I'm now going to just touch on some of the recommendations that can be undertaken in Afghanistan. Firstly, to begin with, we need strict governance within the HR management systems in Afghanistan. We need to ensure that all governmental departments within Afghanistan show transparency. We need to ensure that they adhere to recruitment policies and policies are actually implemented. And we need to ensure that end-to-end recruitment campaigns are monitored for those actually appointed to role. Now, this information can be collected and also reported to the boards at the organizational levels. Consideration should also be made for the aptitude tests that I referred to earlier on. So this could be verbal reasoning tests, aptitude tests, or psychometric tests. Now, the reason I would push for this is because that I believe that the right candidate will be selected for the right role, and not because you just know somebody who knows somebody. There should be moderation on all recruitment panels during interview stage to ensure there's consistency for all interviews taking place. Now, this might seem quite basic, but we need to ensure that the right questions are being asked depending on the interview and the role you're going for. We need to ensure that scorecards, again, very basic, are being utilised, and panel members can be held to account for every decision they make on whoever's been appointed to role. We need to ensure that appropriate inductions are made within the departments so that the individuals given the role know exactly what's expected of them. Most importantly of all, we need to ensure that staff understand the risk connected to their role if they underperform. They need to clarify what it is they're doing, what they're delivering to, and what the actual organisational strategy is. Another one that's quite important to myself personally, we need strict governance of performance management systems. We need to ensure that there's no bias when you're taking these evaluations. We need to ensure that managers are well equipped and well versed to undertake these processes. And last but not least, we need to ensure that there's effective performance management systems within Afghanistan. My last recommendation is that we need trade unions to be systematically embedded into partnering with departments to ensure that our workforce is protected. If we undertake the above recommendations that I've just referred to, I believe that we will strengthen the overall recruitment process as well as improve transparency and build employee capability within the Afghanistan HR management systems. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Fashta. And then our last presentation and paper will be by Dr. Gharani. Okay. She's a postdoctoral fellow. At which institution? At Warwick University. And the title of her presentation is Placental, Structural and Functional Adaptation to a Diabetic Environment.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Raila John and all the organizers for inviting me to talk here today. Because of time pressure, I won't be covering everything. I just want to talk about one of my projects where we study the structure and function of placenta during diabetes. So, to start with, I want to start with the word diabetes. Diabetes mellitus. I'm sure everyone in the audience is familiar with this word, especially in our Afghan communities. In every household, almost there is one person affected with diabetes, and it sometimes runs in our families. So what do we know about it? We mainly know that there is type 1 and type 2. And type 1 is mainly associated with autoimmune disease and its young onset. But type 2 is the more concerned form because it's very common. It's associated with obesity and being overweight. According to the International Diabetes Federation, there are currently 371 million people affected with diabetes around the globe, and this figure is expected to rise to 550 million by 2030. So what usually happens when we have a meal, so the sugars or glucose is absorbed into the blood. In response to that, the body produces a hormone called insulin that helps the sugar to be taken into tissues to make energy for later use. But what happens in type 2 diabetes, that the function of insulin or the signaling of insulin is defective. So therefore, glucose levels or sugar levels build up in the blood, and if we don't maintain it with diet or medication, this could have adverse effect on other organs such as the heart, the kidneys, and the eyes. But my project is focused on gestational diabetes. This is diabetes that is first recognized during pregnancy. Usually this diabetes disappears after the baby is born, but studies have shown that about 50% or more than that women will have type 2 diabetes in 5 to 20 years time, and they are also at an increased risk of having subsequent gestational diabetes with their other pregnancies. There are lots of risks with when you have a gestational diabetes for the mother and the unborn baby, such as preeclampsia and macrosomia and other complications that mother and the baby will be facing with it. But not just that, the complications don't just stop there during pregnancy or childbirth, but also these babies born to GDM or gestational diabetes pregnancy are at an increased risk of developing diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and all these metabolic disorders later on in life, contributing to the already alarming levels or numbers of diabetes worldwide. So the universal screening for GDM in the Western society is that every pregnant woman does a glucose tolerance test at the week 24 to 28 of pregnancy. If the expected mother is found to have diabetes, her glucose levels are maintained either with diet or with insulin therapy, and the growth of the baby is strictly monitored as well. If the baby is growing faster, then the delivery is induced a week or two before the due date to overcome any of these kind of complications. So as I mentioned, diabetic environment causes several changes to the placenta, and we are studying these changes by comparing a large cohort of diabetic placentas to normal placentas. Placenta is a heterogeneous organ. Its main function is to provide nutrition to the growing baby. It also produces several hormones to maintain the pregnancy. It separates maternal and fetal circulation, as you can see in this image, and it's affected by any changes in both circulations. The placenta is majorly affected by the diabetic environment, and it causes several changes to its structure and function as it tries to protect the baby as much as possible. So what happens in if the mother has diabetes and her glucose levels are really high, that affects the baby, so the baby will start producing insulin. That increased insulin in the baby has a lot of growth promoting effects on the placenta and on the baby. This will eventually lead, even if the baby is born, the baby will have hypoglycemia. So as you can see, this diabetic environment in the uterine puts a baby at a higher risk of having all these complications, but also in later life. So one of the other characteristics of gestational diabetes that we are interested is macrosomia. Macrosomia is babies born with larger birth weight than 4 kg. By all means, no, not all babies who are born 4 kg are macrosomic, but these babies have increasing risk of all these complications that I mentioned during birth for the mother and the baby, but they are at increased risk of having obesity later on in life, which is a huge burden on healthcare system as well as on health system. So this is just the mechanisms by which we are studying that maternal obesity or maternal hyperglycemia plays a major role in placental growth, allowing more nutrition to be passed on to the baby, and the baby is growing faster, and which is called macrosomia. So the take-home message from this is to spread awareness because back home in Afghanistan we have so many cases of diabetes and many of them might go unnoticed. So all we want is spread awareness that every woman, a pregnant woman, should have access to prenatal or postnatal care. If there is a system where a lady can have a GDM glucose tolerance test at the third trimester of pregnancy, and if there are treatments in place and treatments for the baby and the mother and stuff. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Do we have time for?
Yeah, we do have time. I can walk around with the mic.
How much time do we have? 15? Great. So we have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And I just wanted to say, I thought one really interesting thread between all 4 presentations is that you all focused on the way that knowledge is produced and passed between different groups. So whether it's like in terms of cultural and religious practices, in terms of education and research, in terms of practices of management and governance, and public services, or the way that we manage our health. Right? So how that's done, and then what that means in terms of ethics and also accountability to each other. I thought they were seemingly quite disparate papers, but very well connected in many ways. So we will open the floor. Maybe we'll take 2 questions to begin with, and then have some responses, and then.
Yes, my question to Farishta Omar, and she is working as an HR director. So how you would contextualize your HR policy with Afghanistan? Look into the HR policy in the UK. There's a huge gap in terms of wages. I mean, the wages are far more lower for women than men. And worse in Afghanistan, I mean, women are receiving or earning with the same qualification higher than men. And what is your context that you are going to apply your HR policy in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more, and then have some responses.
Hi, my question is for Hogay. I know it's a 45 minutes, she said it's a 45-minute presentation, shrunk in 7. I just wanted to know the limitations of her research, predominantly because if you heard Farishta's comments about what policies should be implemented and all that. So you've got certain things which, you mentioned we should ask them. But where do you draw the line in your research that, say for example, you have business models like the Japanese one, just-in-time ones, which is applied everywhere globally. So if you tell them you should apply this, would that be considered as a colonialist approach, that this is what I'm telling you is right, so you should do your business like that? So where would you draw the line? that's something I wanted to ask her.
Should we take one more maybe? Is there one more? No?
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Saleh. If I haven't made a mistake, you said that the type 2 diabetes is in rise. It's rising, it's increasing.
Yeah.
And my question is that the reason it's increasing, is it due to lack of awareness, not enough research being done in the field, or what's the main reason based on your findings? Thank you.
Right, thank you. Just to make sure I've understood the question properly, are you referring to the fact that in the UK we have a huge disparity in wages?
Yes.
Yeah. And in Afghanistan we don't have that disparity, or that?
I mean, it's converse. I mean, in the UK, I mean, women are receiving much lower wages.
In the UK?
Yeah, particularly
Okay.
leadership roles.
Sure, right, okay. Right, so a few things come to mind. Firstly, the gender pay gap report, which is something that all organisations are obliged to publish, and the means that are, or the steps that are taken to address the gender pay gap. I cannot comment for the whole of the UK organisation, but I can say for the civil service that gender pay gap is actually pretty equal. In departments where it's not equal, there are steps put into place to ensure that we see more equality within gender pay gap. How this can relate to Afghanistan, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there before we issue any kind of pay gap reports. But as mentioned in my presentation, I think there are key lessons learned here that we could utilise within Afghanistan. I know you mentioned that we actually need to mobilise the women in the Afghan workforce, and I completely agree with that. I feel like half of our population is not being utilised, and if they were, that would do tremendous things for our economy. But one step at a time. I think once we have a more utilised workforce in terms of women, I think we can implement the gender pay gap as appropriate within Afghanistan and share best practices there at that time.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking. So we don't live on islands. Afghanistan doesn't live on an island, so we definitely need to learn from other countries. And I think that the world's been in a conversation for centuries, right? The East learned from the West learned from the East. I mean, if you look at some would call it the Islamic Golden Age, right? They learned from the Greek philosophers, the West learned from the Islamic thinkers. And so indigenous methodology doesn't say we don't want anything from abroad, we don't want anything from other people. It's saying we want it adapted, right? We don't want it to undermine our social, cultural, religious ideas. And we can't just pick up best practices in other countries and just assume that they will work in Afghanistan or in any foreign context, right? We have to adapt it. We have to get people on the ground, on the team, and say, okay, this is how it could work. And some really good examples of that is actually Peace Linguistics. It's a program where they've developed it in the US and then they tried it in China. And actually, so they've talked about ethnic groups, and sometimes there can be some negative comments about different ethnic groups. And if you target that in a classroom, it's shown that by explicitly teaching like peaceful language and explicitly telling you like, look, when you say these things, it's harmful to other people, children learn, right? And if you implement this peace linguistics thing, it's not based in just one culture. That's a best practice that we can adapt in Afghanistan really well, right? Or the history textbook project. It's a really good project that's done between Pakistan and India. So the textbooks are very, very biased in Pakistan against Indians, and in India it's very biased against Pakistan. And so what they've done is, instead of working on the Pakistani textbook or the Indian, is they put both textbooks side by side, and the students learn about the different countries, and they sympathize and have empathy towards the other side. And they learn, look, it's the same event, right, partition, but these two different countries and nationalities experience it differently. And we could definitely adapt this to Afghanistan, right? We can have like the 3 ethnic history textbooks, because no one's going to agree to one ethnic history, right? everyone thinks that their history is right. But then if you have these three different histories side by side, we can maybe teach children that there's different perspectives, people live different realities, and you can learn about different views and respect them. Anyways, but those are the examples, right? You can adapt them to be socially and culturally and religiously relevant. And we don't live on islands, right? So just continuing this global conversation. Is there another part that I didn't address, or is that's good? Okay.
Hi, thank you for the question. Yes, definitely awareness is an important issue, but type 2 diabetes is increasing because of obesity, because of nutrition availabilities, that people probably eating a lot and not exercising. And in fact, awareness will play a major role, because if you're aware of that we are eating a lot and we don't do exercise, then obviously things will go wrong. Awareness is important, but also nutrition availability and obesity. So if size, if food and diet, everything is controlled, and we do exercise next to it, then hopefully we can get that.
Great. Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Does anybody have one last burning question?
Just a general comment. I know we've got such talented people sitting here.
Just so everybody can hear you.
Thank you. Just it's just a quick question, to be honest with you. So I know that such talented people sitting here, and you've all well done to you all. And I can understand how difficult it is from a war-torn country and being that levels that you are now. I know Hogai was talking about research and how important it is to mold it to the way it needs to be done in these countries, and your HR policies and your work on the how are we going to cascade this to Civil Service Commission of Afghanistan? How are we going to be cascading these messages to the Ministry of Health and Education over there, and how are we going to cascade this to the work that needs to be done in building the economy and research that needs to be done, and how we can do it? What is the mechanism? I think that you guys can bring a lot to help the government over there. And first of all, you talked about the HR policy. You can relate that to the British Civil Service Commission, and how you can interlink that to Afghan Civil Service Commission. Your work to the Ministry of Public Health, we've got women there, but they have the same problems there, and you've done a great job by doing this work. And Hogai, I completely agree with you. I've been in Afghanistan myself. People are implementing programs without knowing it, just implementing without getting the details of it, of what is actually needed there, and how important it is, especially with job creation. How we can create jobs in Afghanistan, what needs to be done. So that is my question. How we can cascade this to help the country. I know this is great, so it's for all of you.
I think the simplest way I can answer that is to get a ticket and get on a plane and go over to Afghanistan.
There should be a mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what we
100%.
need to create.
We don't want to leave Walid out. He sat in the audience. I wonder if you want
That's
to.
a very certain nowadays. Myself, my wife knows, and I do a lot of jogging and running, but still when I go to my doctor, I have this fat liver, and I couldn't believe that.
Yes.
I've done sports all my life, but still I have diabetes, and discussed this with Dr. Saraswal previously. And I think it's the food quality. Every time I speak something, I think I should listen. See, you have another proverb in Afghanistan, like ladies, if they touch anything. No, they have the other way around. They say when men touch something, it goes wrong. Yeah, she always tells me. So yeah, the food quality is very important. Especially we are not the fertilizers are used a lot nowadays, and we have to. I'm nowadays drinking water.
Yes, different types of food is important, especially we Afghans, we just have rice and bread, and obviously if we reduce the carbohydrates and increase fibers, fruit and vegetables. That like change in our diet is very important to have a healthy lifestyle.
Press the bottom. I think I'll take that from you.
So I think it's important to have a
Okay, thank you. And then Claire? And I think that would be the last comment.
Okay, I'll keep it short. Thank you. That's such a great comment and question. Thank you. Everyone has had great comments and questions, but I think what we should do is call people out, right? When they do unethical research, when they do a lot of harm and be insensitive in Afghanistan, and that includes like a lot of the contracts that go out in Afghanistan, making sure that the locals are actually involved, and it's not just diaspora people getting contracts and then leaving with a lot of money, making sure it trickles down, right? But I think Afghanistan has some really great think tanks, and some of the best research I've seen has come out of Afghanistan from Afghan researchers. And I always find when I look at research, it's the most honest research I find when I look at these journals. Sadly, what I think a big problem is they don't get to publish their work in really high-rated journals, and so their research can be pushed aside. So just making sure, like, if knowing that we have these privileges and power here, what can we do to edit their work, right? So they do get into high-impact journals, into one of the better journals that will be disseminated higher. But also in terms of job creation, just making sure it's sustainable, that when aid leaves, that those jobs still stay there, right? And understanding that there's not enough jobs for everyone, and that we do need to leave it to be sustainable, and and to make sure that people aren't just dependent on the government, because the government might leave, right? The government's not secure. The Taliban might take the country back, and what are we doing to make sure those things are sustainable, and that they're bottom-up created, right, from the community, and they address the local needs and wants, rather than just the international agenda. And just doing research on Afghan people's terms, right? So going to Afghanistan and saying, what are your terms? What do you want out of this research? And what will make it okay for me to do this research? If that includes paying, or if that includes putting their names on it, or if that includes giving them something, collaborating is obviously something that needs to be done, but also bringing Afghan voices to the front. I just want to give a shout out to this book. It's by Maya Evans, who's in the crowd. The Quakers do really good jobs by going in and getting Afghan voices. It's called Afghanistan: Hidden Voices from a Forgotten War. I don't know if this is done with indigenous methodology, but it is, the method used was getting stories out of Afghanistan, right? Rather than going in and saying, okay, 80% of women, this and that, quantitative studies, numbers. It's like you're bringing out the humanity out of people, right? When you listen to their stories. And saying, like, look, qualitative work is sometimes more ethical because it has a more humane side to it. That's all I have to say.
Good. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay.